Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. When the paramedics got there, Michael Cochran was lying on the floor, cold sweat soaking his shirt. His pupils were dilated, unresponsive. And his wife? She said he just needed rest. That call to 911 wasn't a cry for help. It was the start of something darker. February 6th, 2019, Beckley, West Virginia. At 9:07 a.m., a call came through Raleigh County Dispatch. A woman's voice, calm, steady, said her husband had collapsed in the hallway of their home. "He's breathing, but out of it," she noted, before giving her address on Mulberry Street. She didn't mention heart trouble, stroke symptoms, or anything else typically expected in a call like that. Just one odd detail: he might be having low blood sugar. When EMTs arrived 6 minutes later, Michael Cochran, 38, was curled sideways on the hardwood floor. There was vomit beside him. His shirt was damp. Vital signs were unstable. Systolic pressure dangerously low, pulse erratic. When they asked about his medical history, his wife, Natalie Cochran, stated he had no diabetes but had felt off the past few days. That wasn't just a red flag. That was procedural alarm. Paramedics administered dextrose intravenously and began transport to Raleigh General Hospital. By the time he reached the ER, Michael was in a deep coma. Initial labs confirmed his blood glucose had crashed well below critical levels, under 20 milliliter DL, consistent with severe insulin overdose. But there were no medical records showing he used insulin. No prescription, no history. Still, no autopsy was ordered, no toxicology beyond the basic ER panel. His death was ruled cerebral edema due to prolonged hypoglycemia. 5 days later, on February 11th, he was pronounced dead. The file was closed. Michael Cochran's death didn't make headlines. He wasn't famous. No history of abuse, no dramatic past. Just a local Army vet who married his college girlfriend, worked a quiet maintenance job, and died unexpectedly in his own home. It was the kind of death that gets filed away under tragic, not suspicious. But one detail lingered in the paramedics' notes. Patient presented with extreme hypoglycemia, insulin suspected. Wife denied any use of insulin, said he needed rest, appeared calm, emotionally flat. That's not something you see often, especially from someone watching their husband seize on the floor. There was no active investigation, not yet. At that point, the focus was still clinical. Medical records, family statements, and preliminary tests. No cause to question the wife, no signs of forced trauma, no needle marks were noted at intake, though it's worth stating that examination wasn't thorough. Not when the working diagnosis was natural death. What most people didn't know, and what wouldn't surface until 2 years later, was that Natalie Cochran wasn't just a pharmacist. She was also the CEO of a private defense contracting company that didn't actually exist. Raleigh County Coroner's Office internal note, not released publicly at the time. Cause of death assigned due to absence of trauma or known disease. No autopsy requested by family. Low suspicion for foul play. The phrasing was precise, neutral, but the lack of deeper inquiry would later be scrutinized by federal agents, forensic pathologists, and even state prosecutors. Because what no one knew then was that Michael's death didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in the middle of a $2 million Ponzi scheme. Michael's obituary was short. It mentioned his love of hunting, his service in the Army, and his marriage of nearly 20 years. Natalie wrote it herself. No mention of the collapse. No mention of the 5 days in the ICU. No thanks to the first responders who tried to stabilize him. Just, he passed peacefully with loved ones. Except no one in the room that day described it as peaceful. That should have been the end of it. But the ER notes sat in a file. The 911 call stayed archived. And somewhere deep in the forensic databases, a toxicology alert from a different jurisdiction, flagged months later, would collide with Michael's case. When it did, the pieces started aligning. And sometimes, that was the problem. In towns like Beckley, West Virginia, people know your middle name, your mortgage, and what brand of dog food you buy. That kind of intimacy creates the illusion that crimes, especially the calculated ones, can't hide for long. But sometimes they don't just hide. They operate in plain sight. Michael Cochran's death didn't trigger suspicion, not right away. On the surface, there was nothing that stood out. No trauma, no police report, no public whispers of wrongdoing. What the community saw was a sudden medical event. What they missed was a multi-million-dollar lie slowly unraveling in the background. Natalie Cochran introduced herself to most people in Beckley as a pharmacist. She'd worked at several chain locations in the state, held an active license, and spoke the kind of industry jargon that made people defer to her authority. But behind the counter, she was running something else. A company called Tactical Solutions Group, TSG for short. TSG, by all appearances, was a private contracting firm specializing in equipment supply for federal agencies. Her pitch was smooth. She was a middle agent, fulfilling defense-related procurement contracts on tight deadlines. She said the government was notoriously slow to reimburse, so she offered trusted individuals a chance to front funds and get paid back with interest once the contracts cleared. It sounded legitimate, just obscure enough to feel real, and just lucrative enough to feel exclusive. Investors ranged from her co-workers and old classmates to church members and family acquaintances. Many wired tens of thousands of dollars to Natalie's business account. Some received returns at first. Others were told their payment was still being processed by the Department of Defense or FEMA or whichever agency she was currently naming in the cycle. Her materials looked professional. Emails often copied .gov domains. The invoices were designed to mirror actual government formats. Some later proven to be direct replicas of real procurement documents, altered slightly to include her name and company. It wasn't sloppy, it was strategic. What the records would later show, however, was that many of those documents were generated days or even weeks before the actual federal requests were published online. Forensic analysts retrieved metadata from her home computer confirming the timestamps. The files weren't responsive to real contracts. They were predictive fakes. The money didn't go to logistics or supply chain vendors. It went into Natalie's personal assets: a fully paid house in Beaver, a Shelby Cobra replica, luxury items, and retail purchases. Nearly $2 million passed through her accounts between 2017 and 2019. Michael's name appeared on some of the business filings, but only as a second signature. No login records, no financial activity, no email access from his devices. He wasn't on the bank accounts, not on the credit cards, not in the business communication threads. He wasn't running the scheme, he was standing next to it. Still, his name being on the LLC gave the appearance of involvement. It gave the illusion that he understood what was happening. But those illusions began to fray in the months before he died. In January 2019, Michael made several calls to a longtime family contact, a retired Army colonel who had since become an attorney in Charleston. There were no recordings of the conversations, but phone records verified the dates. 4 calls, all within 2 weeks. There was no follow-up paper trail, but the timing matters because shortly after that last call, co-workers started noticing a shift. Michael looked tired, distracted. He started asking offhand questions about business incorporation, insurance coverage, and asset protection, terms that hadn't been part of his vocabulary before. He mentioned not being able to sleep. Once he left early without explanation, an uncharacteristic move for someone described as punctual to a fault. Those closest to him couldn't say for sure whether he was afraid, but they agreed on one thing: he wasn't at ease. Natalie never spoke about any of this. In the days leading up to Michael's collapse, she made no mention of stress, concern, or tension. No outreach to friends, no discussion of changes at home. When paramedics arrived, her demeanor was flat, clinical. When asked about medications or conditions, she simply said he felt off. But now in retrospect, that word, off, carries weight. Because what does off mean when one spouse controls the money, the documents, the lies, and the other starts asking questions? After Michael's death, a quiet funeral was held. Natalie wrote the obituary. It mentioned his military service and love of hunting. It didn't mention the sudden collapse, or the 5 days in a coma, or that he died without a formal autopsy. His passing was framed as peaceful, just another tragedy in a small town. The community moved on, but the documents didn't. The hard drives, the invoices, the emails, They were still there, archived and dormant, until someone started looking. And when they did, the cracks in Natalie's story didn't just widen, they split everything open. By late 2018, the numbers no longer made sense, even to the people who once believed every word. Natalie Cochran had built a convincing illusion. Tactical Solutions Group, or TSG, still looked like a legitimate government contractor on paper. But below that surface, the cracks were widening. Spreadsheets weren't balancing, payments were late, communications started shifting from confident to vague. Several early investors, who had been promised fixed returns within 90 days, were now well past their due dates with no payouts. Some received partial deposits, others were met with increasingly technical explanations. Federal audit delays, new government protocols, unexplained procurement backlogs. Natalie's language remained professional, and she never raised her voice, but she also never delivered. One pharmacist from Kanawha County wired $65,000 in October 2018. He was told it would be part of a logistics pre-buy for FEMA mobile medical units. The invoice looked real, complete with project codes and a federal contract number that, at the time, was inactive but not yet publicly assigned. By January, he still hadn't received a dime. When he emailed Natalie, she replied with a scanned copy of what appeared to be a check in the mail, drawn from an out-of-state trust account that didn't exist. Meanwhile, the Cochran family's personal spending didn't slow down. Property records confirmed the acquisition of a second home in Raleigh County. Security footage later recovered from a jewelry store in Charleston showed Natalie finalizing a purchase of a $27,000 engagement-style ring for herself. That transaction, according to bank records, was completed with investor funds. Forensic accountants brought in during the 2021 wire fraud prosecution traced more than a dozen similar transactions, all routed through shell accounts. The movement of money was fast, deliberate, and designed to confuse low-level inquiry. But it wasn't impenetrable. The numbers, once they were lined up and parsed chronologically, told a clean story. Money came in under the guise of investment and was immediately diverted for personal use. Michael Cochran's name still showed up on limited paperwork, enough to warrant initial scrutiny. But as analysts reviewed the chain of custody for each major asset, they found no matching access logs from his devices. None of the financial transfers passed through his accounts. None of the forged documents were created from his email. He didn't send the fake contracts. He didn't sign the invoices. He didn't even know most of the investors. But he did start to notice something was wrong. Internal family text messages, later obtained from Natalie's seized iPhone, show subtle references from Michael beginning in December 2018. "We need to go over the books. I want to talk about separating this stuff legally." And finally, in January 2019, "I think we're in trouble, Nat." Natalie never replied to that last message. Michael's co-worker at the distribution center, who was later interviewed by state authorities, reported a similar shift. "He looked like he hadn't slept. I asked if he was all right, and he just said, 'I can't talk about it. It's complicated.'" He didn't say much more, but 3 weeks later he collapsed in his home. That part was already in the report. One of the more telling discoveries didn't come from a financial document, but from a quiet, simple form. An email dated February 2nd, 2019, 4 days before Michael's collapse. It was sent from a private Gmail account belonging to Natalie. The subject line was a single word: transfer. The body contained routing numbers, a bank name in Panama, and a message: "Close this cycle before next Friday." There was no reply, but the timing raised questions. And it forced investigators to consider that the scheme was no longer just about taking money. It was now about shutting it down before someone could expose it. Michael had unknowingly become a liability, a potential leak. His doubts were no longer private. His calls to the attorney had created a traceable record. And inside the system Natalie had built, a single leak could collapse everything. This wasn't a con that unraveled over a decade. It was fast, compressed, built and destroyed in under 3 years. And when the bottom fell out, it didn't just cost people their savings. It cost a man his life. That part wasn't in any of the investor contracts, but it was written, eventually, into an indictment. Michael Cochran never filed a police report. He didn't write a formal complaint. He didn't leave behind a typed letter or video recording, But between December 2018 and February 2019, his movements shifted just enough to create a trail. And for investigators years later, that trail wasn't made of statements. It was made of data. By that winter, he had begun separating his digital life from Natalie's. His Google account showed a sudden drop in shared devices. Access logs from their home router, subpoenaed postmortem, confirmed that his phone and laptop began operating on isolated networks. He disconnected their cloud calendar, stopped syncing shared contacts. To a casual observer, these were minor acts. To digital forensic analysts, they marked intent. In parallel, his phone records told a narrow but revealing story. He contacted the same Charleston number 4 times between January 4th and January 21st, 2019. That number belonged to Lieutenant Colonel Douglas K. Warren, Return, a former Army JAG attorney who had since shifted to private estate planning. Warren later confirmed that Michael had called, stating he had some uncomfortable financial exposure through a company his wife was operating. He didn't request legal representation. He asked general questions about liability, joint assets, and what constituted spousal protection. No action was taken at the time. But according to Warren's eventual sworn affidavit, Michael seemed like someone trying to prepare for a fallout he didn't fully understand. He never made a follow-up call. Meanwhile, bank logs showed that Michael began diverting part of his paycheck into a separate account, one that hadn't been active in nearly 5 years. He used it to pay off a credit card balance registered solely under his name. There was no evidence he tried to liquidate assets or remove shared property. But the record indicates clear intent to create legal and financial distinction without alerting his spouse. That same month, Michael's work attendance changed. Before January, he had used fewer than 2 sick days per year for the past 3 years. But in the final 3 weeks before his collapse, he missed 4 full shifts and arrived late on 3 occasions. His supervisor submitted an HR query citing uncharacteristic pattern. The response noted only that Michael was handling some things at home. No one connected those dots, at least not then. After his death, his locker at the distribution facility was cleaned out. Inside were only 2 personal items, a military service plaque, and a printed email thread between Natalie and a person listed only as Investor S. The contents of that email weren't alarming on their own. The phrasing, however, was significant. Natalie had copied Michael on the thread, using his name to reassure the investor that Michael is fully informed and monitoring disbursements. It was dated December 12, 2018. He never replied. At the time, that discrepancy went unnoticed. But during the 2021 forensic examination of TSG's email server, Michael's name appeared over 30 times in similar contexts, listed as a financial backer, oversight figure, or project manager. Investigators found no corroborating digital evidence that he ever sent, received, or read those messages. He wasn't copied. He wasn't CC'd. His name was used, but his inbox stayed empty. And that wasn't just unethical. In the context of the fraud case, it was foundational. Michael may not have known the full scale of the scheme, but the record supports that he had begun to pull away. Slowly, quietly. There was no confrontation, no legal filing, but there was a pattern of retreat, systematic, deliberate, and ultimately incomplete. He didn't have time to finish the separation. 4 days before he collapsed, Michael logged into an encrypted email platform known as ProtonMail, an account that was previously unknown to both his employer and investigators. The IP address was verified through back-end access logs from the provider. The email was active for 6 hours. It sent 2 messages. The first, based on recovered metadata, went to a non-US domain flagged in later forensic reporting for being linked to anonymous legal consultation services. The second was deleted before any trace could be recovered. No content remained, just the timestamps in the destination log. That same day, Natalie made a high-value purchase at a private pharmacy supplier in Charleston. The invoice referenced controlled inventory. She used a personal account, not linked to TSG, and picked up the package herself. When investigators reviewed the timestamps on both events, they matched within 3 hours. Michael's ProtonMail account was never logged into again. In a case built on paper trails, these weren't coincidences. They were indicators, quiet but firm, of a man backing away from something he once stood next to. and someone else trying to erase the evidence before it moved. The signs weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Sometimes it's the accounts that go quiet that say the most. By August 2019, the case against Natalie Cochran no longer hinged on suspicion. It was numbers, dates, transaction logs. Fraud had a footprint, and hers was all over it. The federal indictment came down from the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of West Virginia. Wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering. More than $2 million unaccounted for, tied to a pattern of deceit spanning nearly 2 years. Dozens of victims, friends, neighbors, former colleagues, had come forward. Most believed they were funding government-backed contracts. What they were actually funding was a lifestyle: luxury cars, private real estate, personal accounts. Natalie was arrested without incident in Raleigh County. The press release didn't mention Michael. It didn't need to. Officially, his death wasn't connected to the indictment. Not yet. But for those who had seen the inside of the hospital room 6 months earlier, the way Natalie moved, how she spoke to staff, how fast she signed off on cremation, something had never sat right. And now, with federal investigators unraveling a financial facade built entirely on illusion, one obvious question resurfaced. If she could lie that well for money, what else was she capable of lying about? That's when the case against Natalie shifted from civil to forensic. Natalie pled guilty to 8 federal charges in early 2021. As part of the plea deal, she admitted to creating false procurement documents, forging signatures, and misrepresenting Michael's role in her company. That last part was subtle, but critical. It opened a legal crack wide enough for state-level investigators to revisit his death certificate, which still listed the cause as complications of hypoglycemia. No autopsy had ever been performed. In May 2021, the Raleigh County Prosecutor's Office initiated a quiet inquiry. There was no press conference, no family statement, just a single order signed by a circuit court judge to exhume Michael Cochran's remains. That move wasn't just procedural, it was strategic, because autopsies done at the time of death can miss subtle indicators of poisoning, especially when no one suspects foul play. But post-mortem toxicology, under the right conditions, can still identify long-lasting biochemical evidence. And in Michael's case, it did. Pathologists from the West Virginia office of the Chief Medical Examiner conducted a full re-examination. The results were not ambiguous. Michael had been exposed to exogenous insulin, administered in a quantity sufficient to suppress natural glucose production for hours. The injection site was located on his upper left gluteal area, an uncommon site for emergency medical intervention, but a known location for intramuscular administration by trained professionals. Based on tissue degradation and insulin analog profiling, the timing aligned with a 12 to 24-hour window prior to his 911 call. Natalie had medical access, she had pharmaceutical clearance, and she had no legitimate explanation for how that compound entered her husband's system. This wasn't about financial motive anymore. It was about intent. When state investigators reviewed Natalie's phone history, they discovered that in the week prior to Michael's collapse, she had made multiple contacts with private compound pharmacies, specifically those not required to report inventory transfers to federal databases unless used for commercial distribution. She ordered under her professional license, flagged the products as training stock, and signed for the delivery herself. There was no training scheduled, no documentation to support the purchase. The most revealing evidence wasn't found in a message or a confession. It was in silence. Natalie never mentioned insulin to EMTs, never offered that as a possible explanation to ER staff, and she declined an autopsy before anyone thought to request one. That's not an oversight, that's insulation, a calculated effort to keep a body from telling its own story. Once toxicology confirmed exogenous insulin as the cause of death, the case transitioned from review to prosecution. First-degree murder charges were filed in late 2023. Natalie was transported from federal custody to face state charges. The fraud may have started this story, but the homicide is what defined it. The order was signed on May 11, 2021. The directive was clear. The body of Michael Cochran, interred for over 2 years at Blue Ridge Memorial Gardens, would be exhumed for full post-mortem examination. It wasn't a public act. No cameras, no press. The process began before sunrise and ended before noon. What came next, though, would shift the legal framing of the entire case. By this point, Natalie Cochran had already been convicted of 8 federal charges. She was serving her sentence at a low-security facility in Alabama. Her fraud case had been covered in local papers, dissected in sentencing memos, and closed in public opinion. But her husband's death until then remained officially medical, not criminal. That changed once the exhumation results came back. The autopsy was conducted by the West Virginia Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. Dr. Celia Parkins led the forensic team. Unlike the initial hospital evaluation in 2019, this was not constrained by emergency triage, grieving relatives, or time pressure. The focus was now forensic toxicology and physical tissue evidence, and what they found left little room for interpretation. The preserved biological samples, despite the passage of time, showed clear and measurable levels of synthetic insulin, not naturally occurring in the human body. Further analysis confirmed the presence of insulin analogs consistent with commercial-grade compounds dispensed through medical suppliers. These were not drugs typically administered in a hospital setting unless the patient was a known diabetic. Michael had no such diagnosis. The injection site was identified on the upper left gluteal muscle, not a standard location for emergency responders. Photographic records, tissue biopsies, and residual insulin crystals pointed to deliberate subcutaneous or intramuscular administration. According to the pathology report, the dose would have been sufficient to drop glucose levels to fatal thresholds in under 2 hours, depending on variables like food intake, liver function, and stress response. What investigators needed now wasn't speculation. They needed timeline alignment. Digital metadata from Natalie's pharmacy license showed that in the week before Michael's collapse, she submitted an order to a non-chain compound pharmacy in Charleston. The inventory included insulin glargine and syringes, labeled for inventory training purposes. The invoice was signed using her valid license number. Pickup was confirmed via security log. The pharmacy had no record of scheduled training events with her name attached. The product, insulin glargine, is long-acting. Its profile matched what the autopsy revealed: gradual suppression of glucose, leading to cerebral hypoglycemia, brain swelling, and eventual death. A precise match. Natalie never mentioned this compound to EMTs. She didn't mention it to hospital physicians. It was never logged on Michael's medical intake forms. According to the ER attending, who was later interviewed by the state prosecutor's office, there was no reference to insulin at all. We had no reason to test for it unless told. It wasn't protocol for a non-diabetic patient, and that's how it was missed. The critical evidence wasn't in a confession. It wasn't in a dramatic phone call. It was in the absence of information when that information was most relevant. Forensic science often works backwards, layering timelines, comparing tissue degradation with dosage models, and matching chemicals to supply chains. In Michael's case, all 3 points connected. The insulin was there. The injection was deliberate. The access was controlled. That moved the case from theoretical to prosecutable. On July 6, 2021, the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner issued an amended death certificate. Manner of death, homicide. Cause, exogenous insulin overdose. Under other significant conditions, it listed absence of appropriate medical history, deliberate concealment of pharmaceutical use. That document triggered formal homicide proceedings under West Virginia law. The fraud conviction no longer stood alone. The state now had a body, a biochemical trail, and a suspect with motive, means, and medical access. But most importantly, they had the timeline, and timelines don't lie. The investigators who reviewed the full file later described the pattern as exacting. It wasn't messy. It wasn't emotional. It followed the logic of someone who understood pharmaceuticals, human metabolism, and how to make something look like a medical event instead of a murder. Michael Cochran didn't overdose. He didn't misdose. He didn't forget to eat. He was injected, intentionally, with a fatal pharmaceutical agent. And for 2 years, that fact lay silent beneath West Virginia soil. By the end of 2023, the pieces were no longer scattered. The forensic trail was intact, the timeline held, and prosecutors in Raleigh County were prepared to move forward. The question was no longer whether Michael Cochran had been poisoned. The question was how to present that truth to a jury, cleanly, without gaps. and without giving the defense room to argue accident, oversight, or ambiguity. The core of the case wasn't sensational, it was procedural. The prosecution strategy focused on 5 points: access, timing, concealment, chemical match, and motive. Each element had to stand on its own. Together, they had to withstand scrutiny under West Virginia standards for first-degree murder: premeditation, intent, and malice. Natalie's pharmaceutical credentials gave her legal access to insulin analogs, including glargine. The state had documentation of her license, purchase orders, and pharmacy pickups. The order was placed days before Michael's collapse. Security logs verified she signed for the delivery herself. There was no record of anyone else handling that order. Timing was critical. The pathologist's testimony placed the injection within 24 hours before the 911 call. That aligned with Natalie's exclusive presence in the home. According to subpoenaed cell tower records, Michael had not left the property during that window. Natalie's movements matched, except for one 47-minute gap where her location data was deactivated. That window corresponded precisely with the time she picked up the compound prescription in Charleston. The third element, concealment, was perhaps the most important from a narrative standpoint. At no point did Natalie disclose to EMTs or ER staff that insulin had been administered or was present in the home. Michael had no history of diabetes, no family history, no prescriptions. The ER team treated the event as spontaneous. The omission prevented early toxicology screening and delayed any suspicion of foul play. The prosecution's fourth point relied heavily on the autopsy. Insulin glargine is long-acting. The residue found in Michael's tissue was consistent with that compound, chemically distinct from naturally occurring insulin or fast-acting medical interventions. The pharmacokinetics were clear. The dose was not accidental. It was sustained, targeted, and lethal. And finally, motive. Prosecutors presented financial records from 2017 through early 2019. Natalie's Ponzi scheme was beginning to collapse in January. Investors were asking questions. Michael, as shown in prior chapters, had separated his finances, reached out to legal counsel, and had begun disengaging from his wife's business operations. His silence was no longer guaranteed. If he chose to disclose what he knew, her scheme, and her legal cover, would have ended. That gave her a reason. During pretrial hearings, the defense attempted to introduce a theory of stress-induced mental illness. They argued Michael may have self-injected in a state of confusion or distress, but digital records showed no evidence of him accessing medical supplies, no pharmacy search history, no online purchases, and no contact with diabetic communities. Additionally, the injection site was one he could not have easily reached himself. One of the most persuasive witnesses was the hospital ER nurse who had treated Michael during intake. Her deposition was specific. No needle marks were visible at the time. That supported a scenario where the injection was done carefully, using clinical technique, and then concealed under clothing, not consistent with an emergency or confused self-administration. The state's case didn't rely on a smoking gun. It relied on the absence of randomness. What made it compelling was the structure. It wasn't improvised, it was systematic. Natalie never testified. She remained silent through the pretrial. But the evidence she didn't erase, the inventory logs, the pharmacy records, the IP trail, testified in her place. By January 2024, the court set a firm trial date. Natalie was transferred from federal custody to the Raleigh County Jail under murder indictment. First degree, no bail. At that point, the case had shifted from forensic preparation to legal execution. The science was in place. The motive was outlined. The burden now was on 12 people to see what investigators had followed for years. A timeline too clean, a pattern too precise, and a death too avoidable to be accidental. The trial of Natalie Cochran began on January 8, 2025, in the Circuit Court of Raleigh County, West Virginia. It had taken nearly 6 years to reach this point. 6 years from Michael Cochran's unexplained collapse to the moment 12 jurors were asked to decide whether his wife had intentionally murdered him. Courtroom cameras were not permitted, but transcripts and procedural logs provide a precise map of what occurred. The state's case rested on methodical presentation. Prosecutors did not dramatize the charges. They didn't need to. The facts, aligned and undisputed, carried their own weight. Natalie Cochran was already a convicted federal felon, serving time for wire fraud and money laundering. That history was admissible. The judge ruled it relevant to establishing motive. The jury heard about the $2 million she stole, the Ponzi scheme she created, and the investors she misled. But fraud wasn't what put her on trial this time. It was the insulin. The prosecution outlined the sequence in clean, logical steps. Michael's lack of medical history, the specific injection site, the digital orders for glargine insulin, the absence of any disclosure to emergency responders, the omission that blocked timely toxicology, the silence after his death, and the exhumation that told the truth 2 years too late. Each forensic specialist called to testify did so under oath and without speculation. The pathologist explained how insulin glargine metabolizes differently than the body's natural insulin. The ER nurse confirmed there were no indications at the time to suspect injection. The digital analyst matched order logs with Natalie's license and cell data. No dramatics, just facts. The defense offered little. Their position officially was that the evidence was circumstantial. They did not dispute the insulin overdose. They didn't dispute that Natalie ordered it. Their arguments centered on the absence of direct eyewitness testimony and the theoretical possibility of alternate access. But nothing in the case file supported that theory. Not a fingerprint, not a login, not a motive for anyone else. Natalie declined to testify. Her attorneys offered no final rebuttal. There were no closing tears, no final appeal for sympathy. The jury deliberated for just over 4 hours. On January 12, 2025, Natalie Cochran was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of her husband, Michael Cochran. The sentence was immediate and mandatory. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. She showed no visible reaction. Her conviction brought closure, but not satisfaction, to those who had waited since 2019. Michael's sister, who had testified briefly, left the courthouse without speaking to press. One of his former co-workers said later in an interview, "It's not just what she did, it's how long she got away with it, with all of us thinking she was grieving." The town of Beckley had once regarded Natalie as a quiet professional. That image collapsed not with scandal, but with documentation. Purchase orders, timestamps, tissue samples. In the end, it wasn't emotion or anger that brought the truth forward. It was science. The most devastating thing about the case wasn't how shocking the method was. It was how ordinary it appeared. Insulin, a routine pharmacy item, misused once with lethal intent and concealed under clinical silence. Michael's death was preventable, but when a killer knows the rules of biology and the rules of procedure, they can exploit the space between systems. Medicine and law enforcement do not always speak the same language. In this case, it took years for them to sync. There is no public fund in Michael's name, no foundation, just a grave that was opened once, because someone insisted the answers weren't complete. The value of truth in this story isn't in what was finally proven. It's in what it cost to prove it. Not every crime is loud. Not every killer needs a weapon. Some crimes hide behind credentials, and some truths are delayed because no one thinks to ask the right question until it's too late. Natalie Cochran will die in prison. Michael Cochran died in silence. Only one of those was a choice. In the end, stories like Michael's remind us that danger doesn't always come with warning signs. Injustice doesn't always come quickly. As someone who's lived through these stories, I've learned this. Trust is powerful, but blind trust can be fatal. Ask questions. Speak up, even if it's uncomfortable. Your silence could cost more than your peace. It could cost your life. What do you think? Should signs of financial deceit be taken more seriously in close relationships? If this video moved you, leave a comment. Let me know where you're watching from or what this story made you feel. And if you didn't enjoy it, I'd love to know why. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next real-life case we break down together.